Following arduous marches beneath a persistent European twilight, the directive to lay down arms arrived. For the German combatants who had weathered the inferno of conflict, this capitulation signified not merely the cessation of hostilities, but also the shattering of deeply ingrained tenets of valor, perseverance, and allegiance to the Reich. Many were mere youths, their grip tight on worn footwear and threadbare overcoats. Others were seasoned veterans, having witnessed firsthand the brutal realities of Stalingrad, Normandy, or the devastation of their own urban centers. As Allied trucks and trains commenced their westward movement, laden with prisoners, hushed exchanges of speculation rippled through their ranks. Perhaps England awaited them, or a holding facility in France. The ensuing revelation, however, delivered a profound jolt. They were not to be detained within Europe at all. Instead, they were being ferried aboard colossal vessels destined for passage across the Atlantic. The voyage itself proved disorienting. Aboard the transport ships, the captives were packed into compartments designed for uniformed servicemen, not detainees. The atmosphere was close and moist, heavy with the scent of brine and oil. Yet, for many, a peculiar sense of relief pervaded. The war was concluded for them. The barrage of artillery would cease, and the desperate defense against encroaching armies would be no more. Nevertheless, whispers persisted regarding their impending reception in America. Decades of official pronouncements had consistently depicted the United States as a land inhabited by rapacious capitalists, where the working populace endured abject misery and adversaries faced unremitting harshness. Apprehensions of torture or execution were rampant. Others braced themselves for chronic hunger and back-breaking toil. The Atlantic crossing continued its expanse. Under the watch of American naval personnel, the Germans began to observe subtle details that defied their preconceptions. Their meals, though portioned, were surprisingly ample when contrasted with the gnawing hunger they had endured in the war's closing months. The bread was soft, butter graced their tin trays, and even coffee was served in substantial mugs. The sentinels themselves were firm, but displayed no overt savagery, often exhibiting a detached indifference rather than outright animosity. These were not the monstrous figures portrayed in Nazi propaganda. They were young men engaged in camaraderie, occasionally offering a cigarette without a second thought. Days merged into an indistinguishable passage across the ocean, and with them came an unexpected transformation in the German psyche. While trepidation lingered, it became increasingly interwoven with burgeoning curiosity. What manner of nation was this, where sustenance seemed abundant even amidst global conflict, and where guards carried themselves with such evident self-assurance? A segment of the older POWs recalled pre-war accounts of America's affluence, of jazz music, Hollywood spectacles, towering skyscrapers, and the ubiquitous automobile. However, these remained distant, almost mythical portrayals. What they were now confronting was tangible reality, albeit still veiled in uncertainty. At long last, the vessels drew near the American coastline. For a considerable number of the younger soldiers, this marked their inaugural encounter with a foreign land so distant from their European origins. The urban silhouettes of ports such as New York or Boston gradually emerged from the mist, a panorama of cranes, industrial complexes, and ceaseless activity. To prisoners hailing from devastated German towns where the acrid smell of smoldering rubble still perfumed the air, the spectacle was utterly overwhelming. They had anticipated encountering similar scenes of destruction or destitution. Instead, they bore witness to vigor, industrial prowess, and immense power. The war, it seemed, had not inflicted the same deep scars upon this territory. Disembarkation proceeded with an efficient, military-grade precision. German soldiers, a shuffling procession down gangplanks, found themselves under the scrutiny of American military police, subsequently directed onto trains bound for the nation's interior. The landscapes that glided past their windows bore no resemblance to their imaginings. Expansive fields unfolded, punctuated by meticulously kept towns, adorned with billboards advertising products entirely unknown to them. Aboard the train, hushed conversations arose among some prisoners, remarking on the profound divergence from the bleak depictions of America they had been fed. The apprehension of mistreatment began to dissipate, supplanted by an unexpected disquietude regarding their own ignorance. It was during these nascent stages of their capture and transit that the prisoners first began to surmise that their confinement in America might not manifest as the severe retribution they had envisioned. Nevertheless, they could not possibly foresee that among the most astonishing revelations awaiting them would not be scourges or privation, but rather the commonplace accoutrements of daily American existence. Cigarettes that appeared inexhaustible, and a peculiar sweet substance known as chewing gum. These minor luxuries would soon evolve into indelible emblems of an alien opulence forever etched into their memories. The initial impressions of America were firmly imprinted upon the prisoners' minds even prior to their arrival at the internment facilities. The overland journey transported them through bustling rail terminals, where ordinary civilians navigated their daily lives with an aura of tranquility that seemed utterly foreign to individuals accustomed to incessant bombardment. Through the windows of the military transport, they observed children indulging in ice cream, storefronts overflowing with merchandise, and automobiles gleaming under the sun. For Germans emerging from cities hollowed out by aerial assaults and from a regime of ration cards that yielded only meager provisions, it was akin to arriving on an entirely different planet. The arrival at the camps was considerably less dramatic than many had anticipated. Enclosed by coils of barbed wire and overseen by sentry posts, the compounds conveyed an impression of security rather than cruelty. Straight rows of wooden barracks extended outwards, their neat arrangement evoking the semblance of a miniature hamlet. Within, the sleeping quarters were sparse but surprisingly robust. Each individual was allotted a mattress, a blanket, and a defined personal space. In stark contrast to the chaos of the front lines, the prevailing conditions appeared remarkably ordered. The American authorities maintained a stringent regimen, yet it was a discipline devoid of malice. Guards enforced regulations with unyielding authority, but not with a sadistic glee. This behavior perplexed the Germans, who had braced themselves for humiliation, or far worse. Food emerged as the initial significant revelation. Within the mess halls, prisoners queued with their trays, receiving sustenance that seemed impossibly bountiful. Generous portions of potatoes, meat, bread that was remarkably fresh and white, and vegetables that retained the vibrant taste of recent harvest were served. Such provisions far exceeded anything the men had experienced in years. Many had resigned themselves to watery broths, ersatz coffee, and stale bread crusts back home. Here, even in captivity, they were being provided with more than their own families might be consuming in Germany. The disparity was almost agonizing. Some contemplating hungry mothers and siblings back in their homeland, experienced an almost unbearable sense of guilt. The guards themselves contributed to this dissonance. They were not the cruel caricatures envisioned through Nazi propaganda. Instead, they projected an air of self-assurance, even nonchalance. Some hailed from farms in Iowa, others from factories in Ohio. Yet all appeared unified in their unpretentious acceptance of plenty. They smoked with ease, shared laughter amongst themselves, and demonstrated scant inclination to torment their captives. The chasm between victor and vanquished was palpable, but it was not poisoned with brutality. To the prisoners, this conduct was virtually incomprehensible. It was during these initial days that the Germans began to perceive the cadence of American life, even within the confines of the camp. Cigarettes were perpetually present in the hands of guards and camp personnel. The pervasive aroma of tobacco wafted through the air, sharp and sweet, lingering on uniforms. Packs were exchanged with the same casual fluidity as one might pass a coin. For German soldiers, who had frequently endured weeks with only a meager handful of smokes, the sight was astonishing. It hinted at a world where such indulgences were not luxuries at all, but everyday commodities as common as bread. Equally perplexing were the camp canteens and small emporiums where prisoners could utilize their modest earnings from labor to procure goods. Even in these locations, cigarettes were plentiful, stacked in orderly rows, while something entirely novel was also on display: brightly wrapped sticks of chewing gum. Few Germans had ever encountered such an item. Rumors circulated rapidly through the barracks. The Americans, it was said, chewed this resilient, sweet substance endlessly, blowing bubbles and snapping their jaws with it. Some found it amusing, others scoffed, but a growing sense of intrigue took hold. What was this curious practice, and why did it appear so utterly commonplace here? As the days unfolded, apprehension gradually yielded to fascination. The prisoners had entered America expecting reprisal, only to find themselves enveloped by glimpses of a society so materially prosperous that even its captives lived with greater ease than many free citizens in Europe. Cigarettes and chewing gum, however insignificant they may seem, stood out as symbols of this opulence. They would soon become objects of intense desire, markers of a civilization that had managed to prosecute a global conflict without succumbing to hunger and ruin. It began almost inadvertently. A guard, leaning against the barracks wall, extracted a cigarette from a pack and ignited it with a match struck against his boot. The nearby German prisoners could not help but stare. The act itself was not unfamiliar. They, too, had smoked whenever tobacco was procurable, but the sheer nonchalance with which the American handled the cigarette was unsettling. He smoked deliberately, savoring the moment, before carelessly discarding the butt, barely half consumed. To men who had once meticulously saved every shred of tobacco, rolled together half-burnt remnants, and bartered crumpled papers for a solitary smoke, the gesture bordered on the sacrilegious. Soon, the sheer magnitude of this abundance became impossible to disregard. Cigarettes were ubiquitous. Cartons arrived in overwhelming quantities, filling camp storage facilities and guardhouses. Packs of Lucky Strikes, Camels, and Chesterfields, rendered in striking red and white, seemed to flow without end. Guards distributed them to prisoners not merely as part of their rations, but often casually, as if bestowing minor favors. Initially, the Germans suspected a ruse, a tactic to soften them before some harsher form of treatment. Yet the supply never faltered. Day after day, Week after week, the cigarettes appeared, as constant as the bread and coffee. For many of the prisoners, smoking evolved into more than a mere pastime. It became a ritual, a means of reclaiming a fragment of their identity amidst captivity. Lighting a cigarette after a protracted day of camp labor afforded them a fleeting sense of dignity. Conversations flowed more readily over shared smoke. Friendships were forged in the ethereal haze that drifted above the barrack bunks. Even those who had abstained from smoking prior to the war soon joined in, unable to resist the allure of something that had once been scarce, but was now virtually unlimited. The simple act of lighting up transformed into a shared experience, binding together men who had once marched under banners of conquest, but were now reduced to numerical designations behind a wire fence. This pervasive abundance also elevated cigarettes to a form of currency. Within days, an informal economic system flourished within the camps. An individual possessing a few spare smokes could barter them for additional bread, assistance with laundry, or even protection from more aggressive inmates. Packs acquired a value exceeding that of coinage, which held no significance in this environment. The Americans appeared unconcerned, perhaps even amused by the miniature marketplace that took root. For the Germans, it represented both a means of survival and an insight into the peculiar American inclination to transform everything into a transaction. What troubled them most was not merely the ubiquitous presence of cigarettes, but the casual manner in which Americans relinquished them. Guards smoked incessantly, their fingers perpetually stained with nicotine, their laughter punctuated by plumes of blue-gray smoke. They offered cigarettes to one another with a spontaneous generosity that baffled the prisoners. Where in Germany men had once hoarded the last vestiges of tobacco like precious treasure, here it was dispensed without deliberation. Cigarettes were not a trophy of war. They were, quite simply, life itself. This stark contrast compelled many to reevaluate what they had been told about America. Nazi propaganda had depicted the nation as morally degenerate, corrupt, and plagued by poverty and societal discord. Yet here, even prisoners of war existed within a pervasive atmosphere of tobacco smoke that seemed inexhaustible. If the enemy could provide such provisions for their captives, what did this imply about the nation's inherent strength and wealth? In the protracted hours of camp existence, as smoke ascended towards the rafters, this question lingered. In time, the unending supply of cigarettes became symbolic not merely of indulgence, but of something more profound, an economy so vast that it could afford luxuries even to its adversaries. To the German prisoners, still haunted by recollections of scarcity and hunger in their homeland, this was both a source of solace and profound disquietude. Cigarettes, once a rare treat, had transformed into an emblem of the peculiar, almost unbelievable reality of their captivity in America. If cigarettes astonished the prisoners with their sheer abundance, chewing gum confounded them with its sheer novelty. To a significant portion of the German population, it was an entirely foreign concept. They were familiar with hard candies, licorice, and mints prior to the war, but never had they encountered this curious substance that appeared to both dissolve and yet persist simultaneously. The initial instance of a guard withdrawing a brightly colored stick from its wrapper and commencing to chew prompted puzzled glances among the prisoners. Was it sustenance, a medicinal agent, or some peculiar American custom designed to mock them? Curiosity quickly permeated the barracks. A few daring individuals accepted offered sticks of gum, initially with hesitation, anticipating perhaps an unfamiliar burst of flavor or an unpleasant sensation. Instead, they discovered a sweetness, sharp and minty, occasionally fruity, that lingered on the palate. And then came the bewilderment. The gum did not disappear. It softened, lost some of its intensity, but remained pliable and chewable in the mouth for hours on end. The Germans could scarcely comprehend this phenomenon. To them, food was intended to be swallowed, nourishment consumed until nothing remained. Yet here was a luxury conceived not for survival, but for unending gratification. Rumors proliferated throughout the barracks. Some insisted that chewing gum was manufactured from rubber. Others were convinced it possessed medicinal properties. A few whispered that it was a stratagem intended to keep their jaws occupied and their minds dulled. But for the majority, it became an object of fascination. The men observed guards chewing for extended periods, their jaws working rhythmically as they walked, conversed, or maintained their vigil. The crackling sound of gum, the sight of bubbles being inflated and then popped, was simultaneously comical and mesmerizing. When the canteens began offering gum for purchase, demand surged. Prisoners meticulously saved their meager earnings from camp labor to acquire the brightly packaged sticks, treating them almost as illicit contraband. A single piece could be bartered for a favor or cherished in secret, chewed slowly to prolong the experience. Some collected the wrappers as mementos, marveling at the colorful American artistry, the bold typography, and the cheerful slogans. In comparison to the drab utilitarian packaging prevalent in wartime Germany, these wrappers seemed like artifacts from an entirely different realm. For those who sampled gum for the very first time, the experience carried a peculiar psychological weight. It was not solely the novelty of the flavor, it was the underlying implication. Here was a society so affluent, so self-assured, that it could devise products serving no practical purpose other than pure enjoyment. In their homeland, families were rationing bread and potatoes, and children scavenged for scraps in bomb-ravaged streets. Yet, in America, individuals could expend resources on something designed exclusively for mastication and disposal. To the prisoners, this ostentatious luxury was both enviable and disquieting, a constant, tangible reminder of their homeland's devastation. Chewing gum, in its own unique way, evolved into a cultural bridge. Some prisoners embraced the habit with alacrity, emulating the Americans, learning the art of bubble blowing and laughing uproariously when they burst across their faces. Others, however, refused, deeming it childish or demeaning, a symbol of their subjugation. But even those who disdained it could not overlook the overarching message. America possessed an abundance of resources, enough to indulge its own soldiers, its guards, and even its adversaries. The gum, much like the cigarettes, served as a quiet revelation. It was not a weapon, nor was it a piece of propaganda imposed upon them, but rather an everyday indulgence that spoke volumes about the society they were now glimpsing from behind the confines of the wire. It was small, sweet, and seemingly trivial, yet its impact lingered, profoundly altering how many prisoners perceived the world beyond their ravaged native land. By the time the initial astonishment surrounding cigarettes and gum had subsided into a predictable routine, the rhythm of camp life began to assert itself. The days commenced early, with guards summoning the men for roll call beneath the stark gaze of the watchtowers. The prisoners assembled in precise formations, counting off with weary voices, before dispersing to their assigned duties. Some labored in fields situated beyond the camp perimeter, harvesting crops or tending to livestock for neighboring American agricultural enterprises. Others worked in workshops, undertaking equipment repairs or constructing wooden furnishings. A select few were even engaged in construction projects, their efforts compensated with modest wages credited to their camp accounts. It was through these wages that cigarettes and gum transitioned from mere symbols of affluence to active participants in their daily survival. The canteens stocked them in seemingly inexhaustible quantities, alongside soap, confectionery, and other minor necessities. Each man quickly comprehended that to render life within the camp more bearable, engagement in this internal economy was essential. A pack of Lucky Strikes could be exchanged for an additional blanket, a stick of gum for a meticulously polished pair of boots, or an entire carton for a week's exemption from someone else's chores. The Americans permitted these exchanges to flourish, perhaps recognizing that it fostered order by providing the men with objectives, however trivial. Within the confines of the barracks, the culture of trade evolved into a miniature societal structure. Cigarettes served as the preferred currency, possessing a stability and reliability comparable to any established monetary unit. Individuals who judiciously conserved their smokes accrued considerable influence, while those who squandered them rapidly found themselves reliant on others. Gum, though less utilitarian, retained its own mystique. A piece offered at an opportune moment could cement a friendship, alleviate tensions, or solidify allegiance. In the confined world of captivity, even such minor gestures carried significant weight. The Americans, observing from the periphery, appeared amused by this internal economic activity. Guards would occasionally toss a few packs of cigarettes into a crowd solely for the spectacle of the ensuing scramble, a display that blended entertainment with a peculiar form of indulgence. However, for the prisoners, these items represented more than mere fleeting pleasure. They were tangible affirmations of America's immense power. Even amidst a global conflict involving millions of deployed soldiers, the nation possessed the capacity to furnish luxuries to both its own personnel and its adversaries. This realization wounded German pride more deeply than any insult or punitive measure ever could. The daily routines underscored the stark contrast. In the mornings, coffee was poured into steaming tin mugs, its aroma permeating the communal areas. Lunches frequently featured meat, vegetables, and bread, so exceptionally white it seemed almost decadent compared to the coarse rye loaves they had become accustomed to. Work assignments concluded with periods of rest, during which men would sit, smoking, chewing, and conversing about their distant homes. Evenings brought the arrival of letters, meticulously censored, yet still serving as a vital connection to families far away. In the intervals between these activities, cigarettes and gum provided not only comfort, but also a sense of continuity, offering structure to the long hours of waiting. Gradually, the prisoners began to adapt. They embellished their barracks with drawings, cultivated small gardens, and engaged in games using improvised implements. Cigarettes frequently served as stakes in poker matches or as wagers during games of soccer played in the yard. Gum wrappers were folded into intricate miniature sculptures, exchanged as tokens between friends or kept as cherished keepsakes. For men stripped of their liberty, these small rituals imbued their existence with meaning. The sheer abundance of such minor luxuries prompted many to ponder the fate awaiting them upon their return home. They envisioned families in ruined German cities searching for sustenance, while they, as captives, experienced what felt like opulence. This cognitive dissonance weighed heavily, sparking hushed debates. Was their captivity here a source of profound humiliation or a peculiar form of benevolent intervention? Regardless of interpretation, cigarettes and gum remained an omnipresent presence, silent testament to the fact that they were living within the confines of a world that had not been utterly shattered by war. As weeks elapsed into months, the German prisoners began to perceive the true magnitude of the cultural chasm separating their homeland from the America that now enveloped them. This distinction transcended mere barbed wire and military uniforms. It lay in the profound divergence in the very fabric of daily life, the values espoused, and the things seemingly taken for granted. Subtle indications from cigarettes and chewing gum had already begun to surface, but as the men continued their observation, a deeper sense of disquiet settled upon them. They would share anecdotes from home, whispered late at night on their bunks. One soldier recalled the harsh winters during the final years of the war, when his family would gather in a cellar, rationing out a loaf of bread into fragments so minuscule they were barely perceptible. Another recollected mothers boiling weeds to create a meager soup, while children rummaged through debris, desperately searching for anything remotely edible. In Germany, tobacco had transformed into a rare indulgence, reserved either for high-ranking officers or the clandestine black market. Even seasoned combatants often resorted to smoking dried leaves, stuffed into makeshift paper tubes, their lungs burning from the acrid vapor. Yet here, in their state of confinement, the guards casually discarded half-smoked cigarettes as if they held no value whatsoever. The prisoners found themselves unable to shake the profound humiliation of this stark contrast. They had once fought under banners proclaiming German dominance, repeatedly told that their nation stood as the most advanced and disciplined on the planet. Now they found themselves behind fences, witnessing a society that appeared more affluent, more liberated, and more self-assured than anything they had ever experienced. The simple act of chewing gum served as a potent symbol of this newfound reality. It was not a necessity nor a practical item. Nevertheless, millions of Americans consumed it with a remarkable lack of concern. For the German captives, it presented an almost contemptuous demonstration of prosperity. Their discussions frequently circled back to the prevailing propaganda. Many remembered posters and speeches that painted a grim picture of America as a decadent society rife with corruption, plagued by widespread unemployment and utter despair. But how could such pronouncements be reconciled with the overflowing camp commissaries, the abundance of fresh provisions, and the ceaseless supply of cigarettes? Some argued that it was all a meticulously crafted illusion, designed to expose only the superficial aspects to prisoners. Others maintained that the truth was undeniable, that the Reich had disseminated falsehoods, and that America possessed a far greater strength than anyone had previously conceived. For the younger soldiers, this cultural dissonance manifested in a more personal manner. They observed American guards sporting pristine uniforms, displaying easygoing smiles, and their pockets jingling with coins, which they promptly spent on sweets and beverages from the camp's vending machines. They watched them compose letters to their loved ones, secure in the knowledge that their families resided in homes untouched by aerial bombardment, surrounded by shops and schools that remained fully operational. These small, seemingly insignificant observations carried more weight than any lengthy lecture. They offered glimpses into a reality starkly at odds with the devastated streets of Dresden or Hamburg. Even the simple act of chewing gum became a potent emblem of their disparity. Americans would chew it while on duty, during casual conversations, or while simply relaxing in the sun. The rhythmic popping of chewing gum evolved into the pervasive soundtrack of their captivity. While some Germans derided it as childish behavior, others harbored a quiet envy for the unburdened freedom it represented. To chew without reservation, to expend time and resources on something utterly superfluous. This, they realized, was a manifestation of power. It demonstrated a nation so secure in its affluence that it could indulge in habits that appeared frivolous to men who had grown up amidst severe scarcity. The more they witnessed, the more the prisoners understood that their confinement in America extended beyond merely awaiting the war's conclusion. It represented an unavoidable encounter with an inconvenient truth. The world they had been conditioned to disdain had not only outmatched them in military might, but had also surpassed them in the very essence of everyday existence. Cigarettes and gum were not merely luxuries, they served as irrefutable evidence of prosperity, tangible symbols of a culture that had flourished while their own had crumbled into ruin. When mail eventually began to arrive at the internment camps, the prisoners encountered another painful disparity. Letters from home arrived sporadically, often significantly delayed, and invariably subjected to censorship. Each envelope carried with it the faint, melancholic scent of a war-ravaged Europe. The ink was smudged, the paper brittle, and the handwriting conveyed a palpable sense of anxiety. Families wrote with extreme caution, acutely aware that every word would be scrutinized by Allied censors. They spoke of their health in vague terms, of enduring despite immense hardship. Yet, between the lines, the German captives could discern the unvarnished truth, pervasive hunger, deep-seated fear, and the gradual erosion of hope. In turn, the prisoners, seated at rudimentary desks under the watchful eyes of guards, penned their own correspondence back across the Atlantic. They described their days with meticulous care, cognizant of the censorship, yet it proved impossible to conceal every aspect of their experience. Some admitted that they were being provided with ample food, far exceeding their initial expectations. Others alluded to the peculiar abundance surrounding them, though they often cloaked these observations in carefully chosen words to avoid appearing boastful. "We are treated with decency," one might write. "There is sufficient food, even small comforts available." However, the true essence lay in what remained unsaid, in the endless supply of cigarettes and the pervasive chewing of gum that had become the camp's unofficial currency and enduring symbol. Nevertheless, these indulgences found their way into the letters indirectly. A prisoner might mention that his health was improving, his nerves were calmer, and his spirits were steadier. His family, struggling back in Germany, would remain unaware that a significant portion of this improvement stemmed from the soothing haze of tobacco smoke and the idle act of chewing gum. Some wrote with greater candor, mentioning the availability of cigarettes even to prisoners, as if to offer reassurance to their families that their captivity was a survivable experience. The irony was particularly bitter. Men confined behind wire were smoking freely, while their fathers and brothers in Germany were resorting to rolling scraps of newspaper into tubes. A sense of envy also existed, though it was rarely openly confessed. The men understood that detailing excessive abundance could deeply wound their loved ones who were enduring rationing and constant bombardment. Yet, amongst themselves, they readily acknowledged the truth. In certain respects, life in captivity was less arduous than life back home. One man confessed to another that he felt a profound sense of guilt while chewing gum, picturing his wife dividing a single potato amongst their children. Another admitted to having smoked more in a single week of captivity than he had in the entire final year of active combat. These confessions circulated quietly, like tendrils of smoke curling towards the rafters. The American authorities, naturally, censored any content that hinted at military matters, but they permitted descriptions of daily life to pass through. Perhaps this was a deliberate tactic, a means of informing German civilians that their men were being treated well, thereby sowing seeds of doubt regarding Nazi propaganda. Indeed, families who received such letters could not help but ponder the implications. If their sons were writing about coffee, cigarettes, and gum, what did that suggest about the enemy's true strength? What did it signify about the world that existed beyond the Reich's borders? The outcome was a peculiar dichotomy. The prisoners grappled with the constant ache of separation and the gnawing fear for their families, yet simultaneously experienced the guilt-ridden awareness that, in some ways, their circumstances were more favorable. Cigarettes and gum, those seemingly trivial luxuries, became potent symbols of that widening chasm. They served as stark reminders that America's abundance extended even into the confines of the internment camps, while Germany languished in deprivation. And within every letter, every censored word, lingered the unspoken verity. Their captivity here was not merely a matter of enduring, it was a profound revelation of a world that their homeland could no longer rival. When the war finally concluded and repatriation commenced, the prisoners carried their meager belongings in small bundles, clothing, letters, perhaps a book or two. However, the weightiest items they carried were their memories. They boarded ships once more, this time embarking on a voyage back across the Atlantic, their hearts filled with a mixture of anticipation and apprehension. Some yearned to reunite with their families, others dreaded the desolate ruins that awaited them. Yet, nearly all of them shared a singular lingering thought, the pervasive image of cigarettes and chewing gum, the ever-present symbols of their time in captivity. Upon their return to Germany, the contrast was brutally apparent. Cities lay in ruins, food queues snaked through the streets, and homes were hastily patched together from the skeletal remains of bombed-out structures. Families embraced their returning sons with tears of joy, but beneath the surface of their reunion lay a profound despair. The repatriated soldiers quickly understood that their accounts of American abundance could not be readily shared. To speak openly about cartons of cigarettes and brightly wrapped chewing gum would likely be perceived as fantasy, or worse, as an act of betrayal. Nevertheless, amongst close confidants, tales of guards who smoked incessantly, of commissaries stocked with an array of goods, and of prisoners who had never experienced true hunger, began to emerge. Those who listened, their own cupboards bare, could scarcely believe what they heard. For many of the former captives, this experience fundamentally reshaped their understanding of the world. They had entered America expecting barbarity, only to discover a society that overflowed with luxuries, even amidst wartime. Cigarettes and gum transcended mere memories of indulgence. They became potent lessons. These humble items illuminated the resilience of an economy that remained largely unscathed by devastation. They demonstrated the inherent strength of a culture confident enough to extend comforts even to its adversaries. For men who had once firmly believed in German superiority, this was a sobering and profound realization. Some carried these profound lessons into their subsequent lives. Years later, as prosperity gradually returned to West Germany, former prisoners of war would fondly recall the distinct taste of American chewing gum and the sight of guards casually discarding cigarettes without a second thought. They would recount to their children the peculiar sensation of endlessly chewing something that never seemed to diminish, and the intoxicating freedom of smoking without any form of rationing. For them, these experiences became a concise representation of the larger truth, that America had triumphed not only through its military might, but also through its sheer abundance. Others spoke of the significant psychological burden imposed by these luxuries. To be surrounded by affluence while keenly aware that one's homeland was experiencing severe deprivation was a source of both solace and profound humiliation. It engendered resentment in some, admiration in others, but in all it left an indelible mark. Cigarettes and gum evolved into emblems of captivity, but also marked a pivotal turning point in their lives, a confronting encounter with realities that propaganda had adamantly denied. In post-war memoirs and oral histories, this recurring theme surfaced repeatedly. German soldiers remembered not only the battles they had lost or the comrades they had buried, but also the peculiar shock of being afforded such plentiful provisions during their captivity. They recalled the meticulous care with which they wrote their letters home, carefully omitting any details of their abundant circumstances. They remembered the guilty pleasure of blowing bubbles with chewing gum and the sheer absurdity of trading cigarettes as a form of currency. These memories persisted long after their uniforms were put away and their new lives had begun. Ultimately, the narrative of German prisoners in America was not solely a story of defeat and survival. It was also a tale of profound discovery. The endless cigarettes and the unusual sweetness of the gum revealed far more than mere indulgence. They unveiled a world operating on an entirely different plane of prosperity. And though the prisoners eventually returned to their native soil, they carried with them the undeniable knowledge that they had glimpsed a future that their homeland would require decades to rebuild. Cigarettes and gum, so small and seemingly ordinary, had inadvertently become the unlikely symbols of a shattered generation's stark confrontation with an inescapable truth.